The chamber was restless, a mix of murmurs and shuffling papers echoing beneath the marble dome of the Senate hearing room. Television cameras clicked and whirred as they adjusted focus, their red lights glaring like tiny watchful eyes. At the center of it all sat Senator Tommy Tuberville, leaning back in his chair with an ease that bordered on arrogance. His laughter, low, mocking, cut across the room when Representative Jasmine Crockett began to speak. It wasn't just the laugh itself, but the dismissiveness behind it, a sound that seemed to say, "What could you possibly know that I don't?" Jasmine's hands tightened on her folder. She wasn't new to condescension. As a black woman in politics, she'd met it in boardrooms, courtrooms, and even in her own party's halls. Still, the sting of that laugh pressed heavy against her chest. She had entered this hearing prepared to debate policy, but Tuberville's chuckle made the air feel thick with something more personal, something that reached beyond politics into the realm of dignity. Tommy Tuberville, once celebrated as a football coach before entering politics, was no stranger to confidence. He had built his career on bravado, on telling audiences exactly what they wanted to hear. Yet beneath his practiced grin lay a man who often mistook volume for strength and certainty for wisdom. He thrived on the theater of confrontation, believing that mocking an opponent disarmed them, and usually it did. But Jasmine wasn't here to be disarmed. Her own journey had been shaped by far greater battles than political sparring. Born to a working-class family in Texas, Jasmine grew up in a household where every dollar was stretched and every story carried weight. One story in particular loomed larger than the rest, the story of her father, Henry Crockett, who had served in Vietnam. He didn't speak of it often, but when he did, his voice carried a quiet tremor. She remembered nights sitting at the kitchen table, her father's hands trembling slightly as he folded and unfolded a faded letter from his time overseas. That letter was more than words, it was a fragment of his soul, written in the heat of war, when death felt closer than dawn. Jasmine had carried a copy of it with her for years, tucked into a folder as both shield and torch. She had never read it aloud in public, not once. But as Tuberville's laugh rang in her ears, she felt something stir, a resolve that this would be the moment. The hearing continued with its usual rhythm: questions, answers, evasions. Tuberville chuckled again at Jasmine's sharp critiques of military policy, dismissing her as though she were a child pretending at seriousness. His laughter grew louder when she spoke about honoring soldiers not just in parades, but in policies that meant health care, housing, and dignity for veterans. Finally, Jasmine placed her folder on the desk and said, her voice steady, "Senator Tuberville, you laugh as if service is a punchline, but I carry something with me that I think will change the tone of this room." The chamber fell into a hush. Even Tuberville, smirking, leaned forward with curiosity. Slowly, deliberately, Jasmine unfolded the worn letter, its edges yellowed with time. "This," she said, holding it up, "is my father's letter from Vietnam. He wrote it when he thought he might not make it home, and I think it deserves to be heard." The words, she read, were raw, fragile, yet unbreakable. Henry Crockett's voice came alive through his daughter. He wrote of the jungle heat that never relented, of nights where mortar fire split the darkness like thunder, of the faces of his friends who had fallen before 20. He wrote of fear, not the fear of death itself, but the fear of being forgotten, of returning home to a country that debated wars like sports scores, detached from the bodies that paid the price. He closed with a line that Jasmine's voice caught on: "If I don't come back, tell my daughter someday that courage isn't about fighting the loudest. It's about standing your ground when silence would be easier? For the first time that day, Tuberville didn't laugh. His smirk faded, replaced by something unsettled, something heavier. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the shift. He sat still, his fingers laced tightly together, as though gripping an anchor in rough seas. Around the chamber, the silence was thick and reverent. Staffers stopped typing. Even the cameras seemed quieter. Jasmine folded the letter gently, her eyes lingering on Tuberville. My father gave this country his youth, his blood, and nearly his life. When you laugh at service, you laugh at him, at every soldier who ever prayed to make it home, and I won't let that stand. The moment was more than political theater. It was a fracture in the wall of cynicism that often cloaked Washington. Outside the chamber, veterans watching on television wept quietly in their living rooms. In Alabama, a retired soldier named Frank, who had once supported Tuberville, sat frozen, realizing that the laughter he'd brushed off before now felt like an insult to his own scars. In a classroom in Houston, students studying government replayed the clip, their teacher pausing to let them feel the weight of silence after Jasmine's words. The story didn't end in that hearing room. It rippled outward, sparking debates across the country about what service truly meant, and how lightly some leaders treated the sacrifices of others. Veterans wrote letters to Jasmine, thanking her for giving voice to their pain. A group of young activists organized a rally, carrying signs that read, "Stand with veterans, not against them." For Jasmine, the aftermath brought both praise and scrutiny. Some accused her of using personal tragedy for political gain, while others hailed her as a truth teller unafraid to pierce through arrogance. She wrestled with those reactions in the quiet of her office, staring again at her father's letter. Had she done right by him? She remembered his trembling hands, his haunted eyes, and she whispered into the silence, "I hope so, Daddy." As for Tuberville, the encounter left a mark deeper than he expected. He found himself replaying the moment in his head, Jasmine's voice cutting through his laughter like a blade. For the first time, he questioned whether his bravado had crossed into cruelty. At a veterans' event weeks later, his speech carried an uncharacteristic humility. He didn't mention Jasmine by name, but those who had watched the hearing could see the shadow of that moment lingering behind his words. The climax of their clash wasn't in the silence of Tuberville's stunned face, but in the echoes that followed, in the letters written, the conversations sparked, the quiet shift in hearts across the country, and in the end the lesson was clear. Courage isn't measured in the loudness of one's laugh or the sharpness of one's words. It's measured in the willingness to carry the stories of those who served, to honor them not with empty applause but with dignity and truth. That day, Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground, and through her father's voice, she reminded the nation that silence, when confronted with sacrifice, is not weakness, it is respect.